Man saves mutt from cliff, then discovers something incredible at home. Walter stopped, trying to locate the source of that distressed sound, cutting through the silence of the frosty morning. Leaning on his cane, he walked to the edge of the overlook and spotted, about 60 feet below, a golden-haired dog trapped on a rocky ledge, barking desperately. "My God, how did that animal end up down there?" he muttered to himself, feeling his heart tighten. Walter looked around. There was no one nearby. The small town of Stowe was practically deserted due to the cold front that had scared even the locals most accustomed to the mountain weather. He couldn't wait for help. His 75 years weighed on his shoulders, but that animal's life weighed even heavier on his conscience. "No one deserves to suffer alone in this cold," he said, hurrying back to his jeep parked a few yards away. From the trunk, Walter pulled out a sturdy rope he always carried for emergencies and an old orange jacket his wife, Margaret, had bought for him before she passed 5 years ago. He quickly put it on. The worn fabric still held a trace of her perfume, giving him the courage he needed. With determined steps, Walter returned to the cliff's edge. He assessed the situation with the experienced eyes of someone who had been a tour guide in the area for over 4 decades. The descent would be dangerous but possible. He tied one end of the rope to a sturdy tree and the other around his waist. "I'm coming, buddy! Hang in there!" he shouted to the dog, who responded with eager barks. The climb down was painful for his joints, worn by time and arthritis. Every movement was a cruel reminder that he was no longer the agile man he once was. But Walter pressed on, inch by inch, ignoring the biting wind lashing his wrinkled face. When he finally reached the ledge where the dog was, he noticed the animal was trembling uncontrollably. It was a medium-sized mutt with golden fur and white patches on its chest. Its brown eyes were full of fear, but there was something familiar in them that made Walter hesitate for a moment. "Easy, boy. I'm here to get you out," he said softly, slowly extending his hand. The dog initially recoiled, baring its teeth defensively. Walter kept speaking gently, with the patience of someone who had tamed wild animals before. After a few minutes, the mutt let him get close enough for a better look. That's when Walter realized the dog wasn't alone. Sheltered between the larger dog's paws, nearly invisible against the dark rocks, was a puppy. A small black and brown mutt, no more than 2 months old, shivering from cold and fear. "Well, well, so you're protecting your little one," Walter murmured, his throat tightening. "Don't worry, I'll get you both out of here." The climb back up would be trickier than the descent. Walter improvised a makeshift sling from his own scarf to carry the puppy, and after a few failed attempts, earned the trust of the older dog, who allowed himself to be secured with part of the rope. With superhuman effort, enduring pain he'd never admit to anyone, Walter began the ascent. His fingers, stiff from the cold, clung to the icy rocks. Every step was a victory against gravity and against the years that had taken their toll on his muscles. Surprisingly, the mutt seemed to understand, obediently following his cues like they were old friends. After what felt like an eternity, Walter finally reached the top of the cliff. He collapsed onto the snow, gasping, the puppy still safe in, his scarf and the older dog beside him, licking his face as if in gratitude. "We did it, friends," he smiled, petting both animals. "Now let's get home before we freeze out here." On the way to the jeep, Walter noticed something odd about the larger dog's gait. It was limping slightly on its right hind leg. Still, the animal stayed faithfully by his side, keeping close to the puppy he carried. The return to Walter's small house on the outskirts of Stowe was quiet, broken only by the rumble of the old jeep's engine and the puppy's occasional whimpers. The road was nearly impassable from the snow, something rare even for this area, known as the coldest town in the United States. When he reached his property, a small farmhouse inherited from his parents, Walter took the animals straight inside. The cold was too harsh to leave them outside, even in a shelter. Besides, there was something about that golden-haired mutt that tugged at his memories in a way he couldn't explain. Once inside the cozy house, Walter lit the fireplace and prepared a comfortable spot near the fire for his new guests. He warmed some milk, mixed it with softened kibble he kept for emergencies, and offered it to the starving animals. As he watched them eat eagerly, Walter went to his room to fetch towels to dry them off. When he returned, He noticed something he hadn't before. The larger dog had a small white star-shaped patch on its chest. His heart raced. "It can't be," he murmured, slowly moving closer to the dog. With trembling hands, Walter searched for something specific on the dog's neck. And there it was, a tiny horizontal scar nearly hidden beneath the fur, the result of an accident. Many years ago, an accident he knew well. "Daisy!" he called, his voice thick with emotion. The dog immediately perked its ears and turned its head toward him, a glimmer of recognition in its brown eyes. "Good heavens, is it really you, girl?" Walter's legs weakened. He sank onto the couch, stunned, as the mutt approached and rested its head on his lap just as it had so long ago. Daisy, his faithful companion for over 10 years, who had mysteriously vanished 3 years earlier, was back. Memories flooded his mind. The day he found Daisy as a puppy, abandoned in a cardboard box at the town market, their daily walks through the mountain, how she had been his only comfort after Margaret left, and that terrible day when, after a fierce storm, Daisy simply never came home. "I looked everywhere for you," he whispered, stroking her golden fur, now dirty and matted. "Where have you been all this time, old friend?" The puppy, now fed, cautiously approached, watching the interaction with curiosity. Walter reached out, and the little creature sniffed his fingers before allowing a timid pat. "And who's this little friend you brought along?" he asked softly, receiving a gentle lick from Daisy in response. The exhaustion from the rescue finally caught up with Walter. Leaving the animals comfortably settled by the fire, he went to take a hot shower and change. His sore muscles protested with every move, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. As the hot water eased his aches, Walter couldn't stop thinking about the extraordinary coincidence. Or was it fate? Saving a dog trapped on a cliff during the worst snowstorm in decades, only to discover it was his own long-lost pet, felt like something out of a fairy tale. But questions swirled in his mind. How had Daisy ended up on that cliff? Where had the puppy come from? And most importantly, how had she survived all this time away from home? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. After his shower, Walter returned to the living room. He found Daisy and the puppy sleeping soundly, exhausted from the ordeal they'd been through. He didn't want to wake them. Instead, he brewed a strong cup of coffee and sat in the old rocking chair by the window, watching the snow that continued to fall outside. His phone rang, breaking the cozy silence. It was Elizabeth, his only daughter, calling from Boston as she did every week. "Dad, how are you? We're worried about this cold weather up in the mountains," she said, genuine concern in her voice. "I'm fine, sweetheart, surviving as always," he replied, deciding not to mention the rescue just yet. "The weatherman said this cold front is going to get worse in the next few days. You should come down here until the worst of it passes," Elizabeth suggested. "I can't right now, honey. I've got commitments here," he said, glancing at the sleeping animals. "What kind of commitments, Dad? You barely leave the house since Mom passed." Walter sighed. His relationship with Elizabeth was complicated. Since Margaret's passing, he'd withdrawn into his own world, refusing her invitations to move closer. He knew she worried, but at 75 he believed he had the right to live his remaining years as he pleased. "It's a long story, Elizabeth. I promise I'll tell you everything when we see each other. For now, just know I'm fine, and not planning anything reckless." The conversation continued for a few more minutes before they said goodbye. Walter set the phone aside and returned to gazing at the white landscape outside the window. The small property that had been his family's home for generations now felt even more isolated under the blanket of snow. The next morning brought a break in the storm. Walter woke to licks on his face. He'd fallen asleep in the rocking chair, and Daisy was there just like in the old days, waking him with her morning ritual. For a moment, it was as if her 3-year absence had never happened. "Good morning to you too, girl," he smiled, rubbing his eyes. The puppy, more confident after a night of rest and a full belly, scampered around the living room, exploring every corner with the curiosity typical of puppies. Walter watched him fondly, noticing a small white mark on his snout, similar to the star-shaped patch on his mother's chest. "You need a name, little one," he said, struggling to rise from the rocking chair. His joints were stiffer than usual after spending the night sitting. "How about Scout? One star to accompany another." Breakfast was lively, with Daisy and Scout showing healthy appetites. Walter decided he needed to take them to the vet as soon as possible. They both needed checkups, updated shots, and in Daisy's case, a scan of the old microchip he'd implanted years ago. As they prepared to leave, Walter noticed something odd in Daisy's behavior. She seemed nervous, frequently going to the window and barking at the road leading to the property. "What is it, girl? Afraid to go out again?" he asked, stroking her head. The answer came in the form of a vehicle approaching down the snow-covered road. A black pickup truck Walter recognized immediately. It belonged to Dean Peterson, his neighbor of over 20 years, and lately a constant source of frustration. "What does he want now?" Walter muttered, his stomach twisting at the thought of another confrontation. Dean was a businessman from the city who'd bought the neighboring property about 5 years ago. Since then, he'd been trying to convince Walter to sell his land to expand a tourist venture he was planning. The elderly man's constant refusals had turned their relationship into something close to hostility. Walter opened the door before Dean even knocked. The middle-aged man, dressed in clothes too expensive for the rural setting, seemed surprised by the welcome. "Good morning, Mr. Walter," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I see you've found my dogs." Walter felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Inside the house, Daisy began barking furiously. "Your dogs?" he asked, his voice low and controlled despite the anger simmering inside him. "Yes, they ran off during the storm the day before yesterday," Dean replied, trying to peer over Walter's shoulder. "It's the golden female and a black puppy. Right? I've been looking for them for 2 days." Walter knew a lie when he heard one, and this was a bold-faced lie. Daisy was his dog. He was absolutely certain of that. As for the puppy, well, if it was Daisy's, then it rightfully belonged to him too. "Interesting, Dean, because I found these animals trapped on a cliff, nearly frozen to death. And oddly enough, one of them is my Daisy, who disappeared 3 years ago." Dean's face paled slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Mr. Walter, with all due respect, you must be mistaken. That dog has been mine for at least 2 years. I bought her from a breeder in Burlington. The puppy was born just a few months ago." "Then you won't mind if I check her microchip, will you?" Walter challenged, crossing his arms. "Because my Daisy has one implanted by me when she was just a year old." Dean hesitated, and Walter knew he'd hit the mark. Before the neighbor could respond, a small red car came up the road and parked beside the pickup truck. Dr. Sarah Johnson, the town's new veterinarian, stepped out hurriedly, carrying a medical bag. "Good morning, Mr. Walter. I got your message." "Hand came as fast as I could," she said. A woman in her 40s with lively eyes and dark hair pulled into a practical bun. "The roads are terrible, but—" She stopped, noticing the tension in the air. "Am I interrupting something?" "Not at all, Doctor," Walter replied, relieved by her timely arrival. "In fact, we were just discussing the ownership of the animals I rescued yesterday." Sarah looked from Walter to Dean, quickly understanding the situation. "Then let's settle this simply," she said pragmatically. "If the animal has a microchip, we can identify the registered owner without any doubt." Dean grew increasingly uneasy. "That's not necessary. They're my animals, and I can prove it." "How?" Walter challenged. "Do you have any documents? Photos? Anything?" The neighbor fell silent, and Sarah seized the opportunity to intervene again. "Mr. Peterson, checking the microchip is standard procedure in these situations. If the animals are truly yours, there's nothing to worry about." Defeated. By logic, Dean reluctantly nodded. The three entered the house, where Daisy reacted with hostile barks at the neighbor's presence while staying protectively close to Scout. The scene only strengthened Walter's suspicions. Sarah placed her portable microchip scanner on the kitchen table and asked Walter to hold Daisy. With gentle, professional movements, she ran the scanner over the dog's neck. The device beeped in confirmation, and a number appeared on the screen. Sarah checked her tablet. "Well, this is interesting," she said after a few seconds of database verification. This microchip is registered under Walter Thompson, implanted 9 years ago at Stowe Central Veterinary Clinic. The registered animal is a female named Daisy, a golden mixed breed. Dean's face twisted into an expression of barely contained rage. Walter felt a wave of relief and validation wash over him. "Like I said, this is my Daisy," he stated firmly. "Missing for 3 years, and now I'm curious to know how she ended up with you, Dean." The neighbor stepped back toward the door. "There must be some mistake. I bought this dog. From a breeder in Burlington, you said," Sarah added skeptically. "Mr. Peterson, animal transfers with microchips are recorded in the system. There's no transfer registered for this dog. Besides, mutts aren't sold by breeders." Cornered, Dean changed his approach. "Look, I don't know anything about a microchip. This dog showed up on my property about 2 years ago, skinny and dirty. I fed her, took care of her. Doesn't that give me some rights?" Walter felt his blood boil. "And why was she trapped on that cliff yesterday, Dean? Along with a puppy that can barely defend itself?" Sarah watched the exchange with growing concern. "Gentlemen, I believe we have enough facts to determine that legally the dog belongs to Mr. Thompson. As for the puppy, presumably being Daisy's offspring, he would also fall under the same ownership." Dean seemed about to protest again, but something in Walter's determined gaze and Sarah's professional demeanor made him back down. "Fine, keep the mutts," he said dismissively. "They're not worth the trouble." As he turned to leave, Walter couldn't hold back the question tormenting him. "Why, Dean? Why abandon the animals on that cliff?" Dean stopped at the door without turning around. "I don't know what you're talking about." With that he left, slamming the door behind him. The sound of the truck speeding away broke the silence that followed. Sarah sighed, looking at Walter with sympathy. "Well, that was intense, but at least it's legally settled now. Daisy is officially yours, Mr. Thompson." The older man nodded, still processing the encounter. For 3 years he had wondered what happened to his faithful companion. Now the pieces were starting to come together, but there were still many unanswered questions. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Doctor," he said finally. "Don't mention it. Now how about we examine these two to make sure they're healthy, especially after the adventure they've had?" The exam revealed that both Daisy and Scout were in reasonable condition, considering the circumstances. Daisy showed signs of multiple pregnancies, which explained the puppy. She had some fresh scars and was a bit underweight, but nothing that proper care couldn't fix. Scout, on the other hand, was healthy, but would need all the appropriate vaccinations for his age, estimated at about 10 weeks. "They'll be just fine, Mr. Thompson," Sarah assured him, packing up her equipment. "But I'd like to understand better what happened. How did you find them?" Walter recounted the dramatic rescue from the day before, not hiding the superhuman effort he'd made to save the animals. Sarah listened attentively, her face showing growing concern. "You took a huge risk," she said when he finished. "In that weather and at your age, what would you have suggested I do? Leave them to die?" Walter replied more sharply than he intended. Sarah smiled understandingly. "No, of course not. I'm just impressed by your courage. Not everyone would have done the same." Something in Sarah's sincerity made Walter lower his guard. Maybe it was the fact that, apart from Elizabeth, few people in Stowe truly cared about his well-being. "Sorry for the rudeness. It's just, Daisy meant a lot to me. After my wife passed, she was my only companion for years. When she disappeared, it was like losing a part of myself." Sarah nodded, understanding the depth of the bond. "I completely understand. And now you're reunited with a new member of the family." As she prepared to leave, Sarah hesitated at the door. "Walter, about Dean. I've been hearing some concerning stories at the clinic. It's not the first case of animals found in suspicious situations near his property." Walter straightened up, suddenly alert. "What kind of situations?" "Dogs abandoned on the mountain road, some in terrible condition. Last week, a family of tourists found 3 puppies in a box by the roadside, almost the same spot where you rescued Daisy and Scout." A troubling thought occurred to Walter. "Do you think Dean might be—" "I don't have proof," Sarah interrupted, cautiously. "But I'm gathering statements. If I can collect enough evidence, I plan to file a formal complaint." After Sarah left, Walter spent the rest of the day reconnecting with Daisy and getting to know little Scout better. Watching the two interact brought him a joy he hadn't felt in years. Daisy, despite everything she'd been through, was still the same affectionate and loyal dog he knew. Scout, on the other hand, was curious and clever, with the same spark in his eyes as his mother. The next morning, Walter was woken by the phone. It was Elizabeth again. "Dad, I need to tell you something important," she said, an odd excitement in her voice. "Remember my college friend, Jessica? She moved to Stowe a few months ago and now works at the National Park Visitor Centre." Walter murmured a vague acknowledgement, unsure where she was going with this. "Well, she called me yesterday after we talked. There's a video going around on local social media. A video of you, Dad." "Of me?" he asked, confused. "What video?" "Someone filmed you rescuing those dogs from the cliff. It's being shared everywhere. They're calling you the mountain hero." Walter nearly dropped the phone. The idea that someone had witnessed and filmed his private rescue made him deeply uncomfortable. "That's ridiculous. I just did what any decent person would do." "Well, apparently not everyone sees it that way. The video shows you climbing down that steep cliff, saving the animals. Dad, what you did was crazy. You could have been seriously hurt." The worry in Elizabeth's voice was clear, but so was the unmistakable pride. "And there's more," she continued. "Jessica said several people are reporting similar cases of abandoned animals in the area. It seems your actions have raised local awareness." That immediately connected to what Sarah had said the day before. Walter felt there might be a greater purpose to everything that had happened. "Elizabeth, there's something I need to tell you," he finally said. "One of the dogs I rescued is Daisy." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. "Daisy? Our Daisy?" Elizabeth's voice faltered. "But she disappeared years ago." "I know. It's a long story, and I believe our neighbor Dean is involved." The conversation that followed was long and emotional. Elizabeth had grown up with Daisy, and the news of her miraculous return affected her deeply. By the end, she declared, "I'm coming there this weekend. I need to see Daisy with my own eyes, and meet this puppy you mentioned." After hanging up, Walter stood contemplating the little family that had formed in his living room. Daisy lay near the fireplace, with Scout playing around her. Somehow, his home felt alive again. A thought began forming in his mind. If Dean really was involved in some scheme to abandon animals, something had to be done. Walter knew every inch of those mountains, every trail, every shortcut. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. In the days that followed, Walter began investigating quietly. Armed with his old binoculars and the determination of a man on a mission, he began observing Dean's property from strategic vantage points. From a nearby hill, he could see much of his neighbor's land without being noticed. On the third day of watching, he saw something disturbing. Dean carrying a large box to his pickup truck, from which came sounds that, even at a distance, Walter recognized as muffled barks. The neighbor quickly drove off, taking the road leading to the mountain. Walter didn't hesitate. Rushing to his Jeep, with Daisy insisting on coming along, he left Scout safely at home. He followed the pickup, keeping a safe distance. The pursuit took him down increasingly isolated back roads until he saw the truck stop near a ravine, similar to the one where he had found Daisy and Scout. Hidden behind some trees, Walter watched as Dean unloaded the box and simply left it by the roadside. Without a second glance, the man returned to his vehicle and drove away. As soon as the pickup disappeared around the bend, Walter ran to the box. Inside, he found 3 puppies trembling with fear, not much different from Scout, in size and age. His heart ached at the cruelty of the act. "Don't worry, little ones, you're safe now," he murmured as he carefully placed them in the Jeep. Daisy immediately took on a protective role, sniffing the puppies and lying beside them on the back seat. Back in town, Walter went straight to Sarah's veterinary clinic. The doctor was horrified by his account and the condition of the puppies, though they were physically unharmed. "This is criminal," she said, outraged. "We have to report it." "And we will," Walter assured her. "But we need more evidence." Then his phone rang. It was an unknown number. When he answered, a woman's voice introduced herself. "Mr. Thompson, This is Deborah Wilson from Stowe Community Radio. We'd love to interview you about the rescue you carried out. The video went viral and... Walter almost declined automatically. He hated attention and publicity. But then, an idea struck him. I'll do the interview, Ms. Wilson, but on one condition. I want to talk about a bigger problem we're facing in this area. As the weekend approached, the small town of Stowe was abuzz. The story of the mountain hero and his exposé about the systematic abandonment of animals in the region became the main topic of conversation everywhere. Walter's interview on the local radio had struck a nerve in the community. Many residents came forward with similar accounts of animals found abandoned on mountain roads. Most cases had one thing in common: proximity to Dean Peterson's property. Walter, however, was careful not to directly accuse his neighbor during the interview. He stuck to the facts he could prove, letting listeners draw their own conclusions. The impact was immediate. Several volunteers stepped forward to help with rescues and temporary shelter for the found animals. Sarah, with her professional connections, organized a network of foster homes and procedures for spaying and responsible adoptions. On Saturday morning, Walter anxiously awaited Elizabeth's arrival. He had prepared the guest room and even baked a cornbread cake, Margaret's favorite, recipe which Elizabeth had learned to make as a teenager. When the car pulled up in front of the house, Walter's heart raced. It had been nearly a year since his daughter's last visit. Their differences often made these reunions tense, but this time there was something new in the air, a renewed hope. Elizabeth stepped out of the car accompanied by a tall, well-dressed man whom Walter recognized as Michael, his son-in-law, a university professor in Boston. To his surprise, a girl of about 12 with long brown hair and lively eyes that reminded him of Margaret's emerged from the back seat. "Grandpa!" she exclaimed, running toward him. Walter opened his arms, stunned. Emma, his granddaughter, whom he hadn't seen in person for nearly 3 years, not since a particularly heated argument with Elizabeth had driven a wedge between them. "Emma? My God, how you've grown!" he said, hugging her tightly. Elizabeth approached, her eyes glistening. We thought it was time she saw her grandfather again, especially after watching the rescue video about 50 times. The reunion was emotional, but nothing compared to Daisy's reaction when she saw the family arriving. The dog, who had been in the yard with Scout, burst into joyful barks at the sight of Elizabeth, and especially Emma. "Daisy!" the girl shouted, dropping to her knees as the dog leaped up and licked her face as if no time had passed. "I can't believe it's really you!" Walter watched the scene with a lump in his throat. There was something about this gathering that seemed to heal old wounds, not just Daisy's but the whole family's. As they drank coffee on the porch, enjoying the rare winter sun that had decided to appear that day, Elizabeth explained why. They had grown so distant. "After Mum passed, you shut us out, Dad. You refused our help, refused our company. When we suggested you move to Boston with us, you acted like we were trying to take away your independence." Walter sighed, acknowledging the truth in her words. "I was grieving, Elizabeth. This house, these mountains, it was all I had left. Of her. And of you who had moved on with your lives." "It was our right to move on, Dad," Elizabeth replied without hostility. "And it was your right to stay here. But none of us had the right to sever the bonds between us." Emma, who was playing, with Daisy and Scout on the lawn, seemed oblivious to the adults' conversation. Her bright laughter echoed across the property, bringing a lightness that hadn't been felt there in a long time. "She really missed you," Michael said, speaking for the first time. "She always asks about you, about the stories you used to tell, about these mountains." Walter felt a new kind of remorse. He hadn't just deprived himself of his family's company, he'd also deprived his granddaughter of knowing her roots, her stories, her heritage. "I was a stubborn old fool," he admitted at last. Elizabeth took his hand, squeezing it gently. "And we should have insisted more, respected your grief more. The blame is shared, Dad." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Several cars and trucks parked in front of Walter's property. Sarah was among the newcomers, accompanied by a dozen locals, many of whom Walter recognized from town. "What's going on?" he asked, rising with some difficulty. Sarah stepped forward, holding a tablet and looking both concerned and determined. "Walter, I'm sorry to show up like this, but we have an urgent situation. We've received information that there are more animals trapped on Dean's property." Elizabeth and Michael joined Walter, while Emma approached with Daisy and Scout. "What kind of information?" Walter asked. "One of his temporary workers reached out to me last night," Sarah explained. "He said Dean has a makeshift kennel at the back of his property, where he keeps animals he picks up off the streets, or that people abandon with him, promising to find them homes. But he doesn't find them homes at all, does he?" Walter guessed, feeling his anger rise. "He just abandons them when they become a nuisance." Sarah nodded gravely. "From what the employee said, Dean started this as a kind of community service, charging to take in unwanted animals and promising to send them for adoption. But at some point it became too profitable a business to bother actually helping the animals." One of the men accompanying Sarah stepped forward. Walter recognized him as Robert Miller, the town's new sheriff. "Mr. Thompson, Sarah filled me in on the situation. If what we suspect is true, we're dealing with a serious case of animal cruelty and possible fraud. But we need more concrete evidence before we can take official action." Walter looked at the group gathered in front of his house, people who just days ago barely knew him or saw him only as the old recluse from the mountain. Now they were here, united by a cause that had awakened something long dormant in the community. "What can I do to help?" he asked. "The employee said Dean plans to get rid of several animals tonight before an environmental inspection scheduled for Monday," Sarah explained. "We need to document it." Walter exchanged glances with Elizabeth and Michael. To his surprise, it was his daughter who spoke first. "Count us in. If that man is responsible for what happened to Daisy and those other animals, he needs to be stopped." The afternoon was spent working out a plan. Sheriff Robert, though willing to help, explained that without a warrant or direct evidence, their options were limited. The solution was discreet surveillance of Dean's property, documenting any suspicious activity. Walter, who knew the area like the back of his hand, suggested the best vantage points. He, along with Elizabeth and Michael, would position themselves on a hill that offered a clear view of the neighboring property. Sarah and other volunteers would spread out along the road leading to the mountain. Emma insisted on joining, but the adults agreed it would be safer for her to stay at Walter's house with Daisy, Scout, and the 3 rescued puppies. Reluctantly, the girl agreed, especially when the sheriff appointed her junior officer in charge of the animals' safety. The hours passed slowly as they waited. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, reminding everyone why Stowe was known as the coldest town in the United States. Bundled up and carrying thermoses of hot coffee, the volunteers kept in touch via walkie-talkies provided by the sheriff. It was just past 8 in the evening when the first suspicious movement was detected. The lights in Dean's house came on, and soon after, his pickup truck was pulled out of the garage. Walter, Elizabeth, and Michael watched everything through binoculars. "He's loading something," Elizabeth murmured, straining to make out the movements in the dim light. Michael adjusted his binoculars. "Looks like several boxes or cages." Walter's heart raced. It was just like last time. "He's putting everything in the truck bed," he confirmed, reaching for the walkie-talkie to update the other groups. When Dean finally left his property, the plan went into action. Each group had clear instructions to document without interfering unless the animals were in immediate danger. Sheriff Robert would follow at a distance in an unmarked vehicle, ready to intervene if needed. Walter, Elizabeth, and Michael rushed to the Jeep. Taking an alternate route Walter knew well, they positioned themselves ahead of Dean's likely destination, a remote area near the border of the national park. "There he is," Michael whispered, pointing at the headlights approaching on the deserted road. Dean's truck slowed as it neared a particularly isolated spot. The 3 watched tensely as the vehicle pulled over onto the shoulder. Dean got out, quickly glanced around, and then began unloading the boxes he was carrying. "I count 6 boxes," said Elizabeth, her voice trembling with indignation, "and I can hear the animals from here." Walter felt his blood boil. The thought that Daisy could have been abandoned like this, left to die or wander lost, was more than he could bear. Dean finished placing the boxes on the ground and, without ceremony, returned to his pickup truck. He was about to leave when headlights appeared from multiple directions surrounding him. Sheriff Robert was the first to approach, identifying himself. In the minutes that followed, a surreal scene unfolded. Dean vehemently denied any wrongdoing, claiming he was merely relocating animals that had been left on his property. When the boxes were opened, they revealed 12 animals, dogs and cats, many visibly malnourished. Sarah and the volunteers immediately began tending to them while the sheriff continued questioning Dean. "It's not a crime to take in abandoned animals," the man argued, visibly nervous. "But it is a crime to accept payment to care for them and then abandon them," the sheriff countered. "Not to mention the clear mistreatment, given the state of these animals." Walter watched the scene with mixed emotions. Part of him wanted to confront Dean directly, demand answers about Daisy, about the lost years. But another part was simply relieved to see justice being served, not just for his dog, but for all the animals that had suffered at that man's hands. Elizabeth gently touched his arm. "Dad, it's done. He won't hurt any more animals." Walter nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He looked at his daughter and son-in-law, grateful to have them by his side at that moment. "Let's go home," he said simply. "Emma and the others must be worried." Back at their property, they were greeted by an anxious Emma who had followed everything over the two-way radio left with her. Daisy and Scout seemed to sense the excitement in the air, circling the people with renewed interest. News of the bust and Dean's arrest for animal cruelty and fraud spread quickly through the small town. The next morning, Walter's home became the center of attention as several of the rescued animals were brought there temporarily until Sarah could arrange foster homes for them. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. To Walter's surprise, his property turned out to be perfectly suited for housing the animals temporarily. The large barn that had belonged to his father, practically abandoned for years, was quickly adapted with the help of town volunteers. "You know, Dad," Elizabeth remarked as she helped set up makeshift beds for the dogs, "this place has potential." Walter looked around, seeing the space he'd neglected for so long with fresh eyes. "What kind of potential?" "A permanent shelter for rescued animals," Elizabeth replied, her eyes shining in a way that reminded him so much of Margaret when she had a fixed idea. "Stowe doesn't have one, and from what we've seen, there's a real need." The idea caught Walter off guard, but not unpleasantly. At 75, he hadn't expected to start a new life project. Yet here he was, in the middle of a personal revolution that had begun with Daisy's rescue. Emma, who had been playing with the puppies, bounded over excitedly. "A shelter would be amazing, Grandpa. We could visit all the time to help." Walter looked at his granddaughter, then at Michael, who nodded in support. "It would be quite a task," Walter mused, "and I'm not exactly a young man anymore." "You'd be the supervisor, Dad," Elizabeth explained. "Sarah mentioned she could provide veterinary support, and I'm sure the community would help. You've become something of a local hero, you know." Walter shook his head, still uneasy with the attention. "I just did what was right." "Exactly," Elizabeth agreed, "and continuing to do what's right seems like a good use for this property and your experience." Before Walter could respond, Sarah arrived with important news. "Walter, we found something you need to know about Daisy," she said, her expression serious. Everyone gathered around the vet, concerned. "The blood tests showed some irregularities. Nothing critical yet, but Daisy has a heart condition that will need regular treatment." Walter felt his stomach drop. After finally reuniting with his old friend, the thought of her being sick was devastating. "What kind of treatment?" he asked, firmly. "Daily medication and regular checkups. It's manageable, Walter, but there's a cost, and given her age, we'll need to monitor her closely." Walter nodded without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes." "How much?" Sarah explained. "The treatment costs, which weren't insignificant for someone living on a modest retirement." But Walter didn't even blink. "She deserves everything after what she's been through." Sunday brought a clear, cold day, with sunlight glinting off the snow-covered mountains. Walter's house had turned into an impromptu animal rescue center, with volunteers coming and going, bringing supplies and offering help. Elizabeth, watching her father interact with people in a way she hadn't seen in years, approached with a cup of coffee. "It's good to see you like this, Dad. Alive again." Walter smiled, accepting the warm drink. "It's strange, isn't it? I spent so long hiding from the world after your mother passed. Who'd have thought Daisy would be the one to bring me back?" "And Scout," Elizabeth added, watching the pup who'd become the unofficial mascot of the operation. "He's got his mother's spirit." Their conversation was interrupted when Sarah hurried into the room holding her tablet. "You need to see this," she said, connecting the device to Walter's old television. The screen showed amateur footage, clearly filmed from one of the mountain trails. It captured Walter climbing down the cliff to rescue Daisy and Scout. The video was distant, but perfectly captured the elderly man's determination and the danger of the situation. "This is what went viral?" Walter asked, uncomfortable seeing himself on screen. "Yes, but that's not all," Sarah explained, fast-forwarding. "Look at the background, near the top." When the video was paused and zoomed in, a parked vehicle was clearly visible in the distance, a black pickup identical to Dean's. "He was there," Walter murmured, the realization hitting him like a punch. He abandoned Daisy and Scout on the cliff and just watched. "And if you hadn't shown up?" Elizabeth couldn't finish, horrified by the implication. Officer Robert, who'd arrived to check on the rescued animals, examined the footage with professional interest. "This strengthens our case against him," he remarked. "Would the person who filmed this be willing to testify?" Sarah nodded. "I already spoke to her. She's a tourist who was hiking. She was so moved by the rescue that she started filming. Only noticed the truck when she reviewed the video later." Walter felt a mix of emotions, anger at Dean for his calculated cruelty, gratitude for the chance that had led him to that spot at just the right moment, and a renewed determination. "Sarah, about that shelter idea," he began, surprising everyone with the change of subject. "I think it's something we should seriously consider." The veterinarian's face lit up. "Really, Mr. Walter? That would be wonderful. This property is perfect, with plenty of space and a prime location." "I'm not rich," Walter cautioned. "I have some savings, but not enough for a project of this scale." "We could look into crowdfunding," Michael suggested. "After that viral video, I'm sure a lot of people would support it. And I can help with the administrative side," Elizabeth offered. "I work in project management, remember?" Walter looked at the gathered family, then at Daisy lying peacefully by the fireplace, Scout curled up beside her. Somehow everything seemed to be falling into place, as if fate had just been waiting for him to be ready for this new chapter. "Let's do it then," he decided. The weeks that followed brought significant changes for Walter and for Stowe. The story of the mountain hero and the rescued animals gained national attention, drawing support for the cause. Elizabeth, who had initially planned to stay only for the weekend, extended her visit to help structure the shelter project. Michael returned to Boston to continue his university classes, but came back every weekend, bringing Jessica, who grew more excited with each visit. The case against Dean Peterson progressed, with more people coming forward to report negative experiences with the scheme he operated. The man's property was put up for sale, and to Walter's surprise, the most likely buyer was the Stowe Town Council itself, which planned to expand the mountain's environmental preservation area. One afternoon, as Walter and Sarah reviewed plans for the future shelter facilities, the veterinarian brought up a delicate subject. "Mr. Walter, remember I mentioned Daisy's heart condition?" Walter nodded, immediately concerned. "Aren't the medications working?" "They are, but—" Sarah hesitated. "I found out there's a more advanced treatment, a surgery that could solve the problem permanently, but it's quite expensive and would need to be done in Boston." Walter looked out the window, where Daisy patiently supervised Scout's playtime with the other puppies. "How much does this treatment cost?" When Sarah mentioned the amount, Walter fell silent for a moment. It was exactly the sum he had saved over the years for his own heart surgery, which he had stubbornly postponed, despite doctors' recommendations. "Where do we sign the papers?" he finally asked. "Mr. Walter, I know it's a lot of money. Maybe we could start a specific campaign for this and— No, he interrupted gently. I have the money, and Daisy deserves a second chance after everything she's been through. Sarah studied him for a moment. What about your surgery? Elizabeth mentioned you also needed a heart procedure. Walter smiled. I can wait. Besides, I've been feeling better than I have in years. Having a purpose again does wonders for the heart, Doctor. Sarah didn't seem convinced, but respected his decision. Arrangements were made for Daisy's surgery, and in a few days, Walter and Elizabeth would leave for Boston with the dog. The night before the trip, as he packed a small bag, Walter felt a sudden dizziness. His vision darkened momentarily, and he had to steady himself against the dresser to keep from falling. The episode passed quickly, but left him on edge. He decided not to mention it to Elizabeth. Daisy's surgery was the priority now, and he didn't want anything to distract from that goal. Besides, it was probably nothing, just exhaustion from the hectic pace of recent weeks. The trip to Boston went smoothly. Daisy, always adaptable, behaved with dignity in the car, as if she knew something important was coming. Scout stayed, in the care of Emma and Michael, who assured Walter that the puppy would be well taken care of in his absence. The capital of Massachusetts, with its fast pace and stunning beaches, was a stark contrast to the quiet town of Stowe. Walter, who hadn't visited a big city in years, felt slightly out of place, but Elizabeth's presence as a guide made everything easier. The specialized veterinary clinic impressed Walter with its modern facilities. Daisy's surgery was scheduled for the next morning, and they were able to spend the night at a pet-friendly hotel nearby. I need to thank you, Dad, Elizabeth said as they dined at the hotel restaurant. For all of this. Walter looked at her, confused. Thank me for what? I'm the one who should be thanking you and Michael for all your help. Elizabeth smiled, her eyes shining with restrained emotion. For bringing us back together, for letting Emma get to know the amazing grandfather she has, and for showing that it's never too late to start over. Walter felt his throat tighten with emotion. He thought of Margaret, how proud she would be to see the family united again. You're my greatest treasure, he said simply. It took me too long to realize that. The next morning, Walter and Elizabeth took Daisy to the clinic. The dog seemed calm, trusting them completely. The specialist veterinarian explained the procedure in detail, assuring them the chances of success were excellent. We'll be waiting for you, my friend, Walter whispered, stroking Daisy one last time before she was taken to the operating room. The hours of waiting felt endless. Walter and Elizabeth alternated between nervous walks in the clinic garden and moments of silence in the waiting room. It was during one of these walks that Walter felt dizzy again, this time accompanied by a sharp pain in his chest. Dad? Elizabeth's worried voice sounded distant. Dad? What's wrong? Walter tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. He felt his body grow heavy, his legs giving way. Elizabeth's arms caught him before he hit the ground. After that, only fragments of consciousness remained. Urgent voices, the white ceiling of a hallway rushing past, the sharp beeping of medical monitors, and then darkness. When Walter opened his eyes again, he was in a hospital room. The soft evening light streamed through the window. Elizabeth slept in a chair beside the bed, her face marked by dried tears. Elizabeth, he called, his voice hoarse and weak. She woke immediately, her eyes widening when she saw him awake. Dad! Thank God, she exclaimed, gripping his hand tightly. How do you feel? Like I've been hit by a tractor, he replied, trying to smile. What happened? Elizabeth explained that he'd had a heart attack, not severe enough to be fatal, but serious enough to require immediate intervention. The doctor said if we hadn't been at the hospital when it happened— She didn't finish the sentence, the implication too clear to say aloud. A sudden worry gripped Walter. Daisy, how is she? Elizabeth smiled, tears now of relief. The surgery was a success. She's recovering well at the clinic. The vet said we can pick her up in a few days. Walter closed his eyes, grateful. At least that had gone right. What about me? What's the verdict? Elizabeth's expression turned serious again. You'll need that surgery you've been putting off, Dad. There's no avoiding it now. The doctors have already scheduled it for next week. But the money, Walter began. It's already taken care of, Elizabeth interrupted. The Stowe community started a fundraiser when they found out. Sarah organized everything in record time. The amount raised already covers almost the entire surgery, and donations keep coming in. Walter was speechless. The idea that so many people, many of whom he barely knew just weeks ago, had mobilized for him was almost incomprehensible. But why? He finally asked. Elizabeth smiled, squeezing his hand. Because you showed everyone the power of an act of kindness. What started with the rescue of Daisy and Scout sparked a wave of generosity no one expected. You inspired people, Dad. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tests, appointments, and preparations for the surgery. Michael and Emma came to Boston, bringing uplifting news from Stowe. Work on the shelter had officially begun, with volunteers from town helping renovate the old warehouse. Walter received more visitors than he could have imagined. Sarah came all the way from Stowe, bringing a thick folder with plans and updates about the shelter. Officer Robert showed up with news that the case against Dean Peterson was progressing quickly, with new evidence emerging every day. Even from a distance, Walter could feel the transformation his small adventure had sparked. What had begun as a solitary rescue on a stormy day had turned into a community movement. The day before his surgery, Walter received a special visit. Elizabeth walked into the hospital room with a mysterious smile. "I have a surprise for you," she announced, holding the door open. To Walter's astonishment, Sarah entered the room accompanied by Daisy, who walked calmly with a special harness protecting her surgical scar. "How?" he stammered, too emotional to form complete sentences. "We got special permission," Sarah explained. "It's not conventional, but the hospital has a pet therapy program, and we made some adjustments." Daisy recognized Walter immediately. With restrained enthusiasm, appropriate for her post-surgery state, she approached the bed, gently resting her head near his hand. "Hello, old friend," Walter murmured, stroking her soft fur. "Looks like we're both patched up, huh?" The reunion, though brief, filled Walter with a peace no medicine could provide. Before Daisy was taken back to the veterinary clinic, he whispered a promise in her ear. "We're going home together, all of us." Walter's surgery, performed the next morning, was a success. The doctors were impressed by his quick recovery, attributing it to his determination and family support. "Your father has a young spirit in a body that's learning to rejuvenate," the cardiologist remarked to Elizabeth. Walter's recovery coincided with Daisy's. As he grew stronger, day by day, he received daily reports about the dog's equally remarkable progress. 2 weeks after the surgery, Walter was discharged with instructions to continue treatment at home. That same day, Daisy was also released from the veterinary clinic. Elizabeth joked that they were like soulmates, synchronized even in recovery. The return to Stowe was an emotional experience. Along the road leading into town, banners welcomed the mountain hero and his faithful companion. When they arrived at Walter's property, an even bigger surprise awaited them. Dozens of people had gathered in front of the house, many holding welcome signs. Scout, spotting the car, was the first to run toward them, followed by Emma. "What's all this?" Walter asked, genuinely bewildered by the reception. "A celebration," Elizabeth replied. "For you, for Daisy, and for everything you've inspired." As he stepped out of the car, Walter was greeted with applause and hugs. Scout was jumping for joy around Daisy, who looked proud and slightly bewildered by all the attention. The Mayor of Stowe was present and gave a short speech officially announcing the town's support for the Daisy Mountain Shelter, as the project had been named. The old warehouse, now almost unrecognizable after renovations, was decorated with an inaugural banner. When it was Walter's turn to speak, he found himself at a loss for words. He looked at the gathered crowd, at his family, at the rescued animals now finding shelter on his property. Finally, he looked at Daisy, sitting obediently by his side, just like in the old days. "They say I saved Daisy from that cliff," he began, his voice choked with emotion. "But the truth is, she saved me. She saved me from loneliness, from bitterness, from the isolation I created for myself. She brought my family back to me and gave me a new purpose." Walter paused, too moved to continue. Elizabeth placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him strength to go on. "This shelter isn't mine, it's ours. It belongs to the whole community. It's a reminder that we never know where a simple act of kindness might lead us. I went down that cliff to save an animal, and I ended up finding my way back to life." The months that followed were filled with intense activity. The Daisy Mountain Shelter quickly became a regional model for rescuing and rehabilitating abandoned animals. Sarah became the official veterinarian, splitting her time between the clinic in town and her work at the shelter. Elizabeth decided to accept a remote work offer, allowing her to move permanently to Stowe with Michael and Emma. They bought a small house near Walter's property, creating a natural extension of their family. The case against Dean Peterson resulted in his conviction for animal cruelty and fraud. His property was indeed acquired by the town and added to the environmental preservation area, with a portion designated for the shelter's use. Walter, now fully recovered thanks to surgery and a more active lifestyle, took on the role of shelter supervisor. His decades as a tour guide in the region had perfectly prepared him to coordinate volunteers and welcome visitors interested in learning about the project or adopting animals. Daisy, fully healed, assumed an honorary position at the shelter. Visitors were always charmed by the story of her cliff rescue, and the dog seemed to enjoy the attention, maintaining a serene dignity that inspired respect. Scout grew strong and healthy, proving to be as loyal and intelligent as his mother. He developed a special bond with Emma, who spent every free moment helping at the shelter and learning the secrets of the mountain from her grandfather. On a particularly pleasant spring afternoon, nearly a year after the rescue, Walter sat on his porch watching the activity at the shelter. Elizabeth joined him, bringing 2 cups of coffee. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" she asked, noticing his thoughtful gaze. Walter accepted the coffee, smiling. "About how life turns around. A year ago, I was just a stubborn old man living alone, dwelling on the past. Now, look at all this." Elizabeth followed his gaze. The shelter buzzed with activity. Volunteers worked cheerfully, tending to the animals. Emma led a group of visitors, explaining the project with all the enthusiasm of her 13 years. Michael supervised the construction of a new annex, which would serve as a space for animal welfare awareness classes. Sarah examined a new arrival, with Daisy watching attentively by her side. "Mom would be proud," Elizabeth remarked. Walter nodded, feeling Margaret's presence closer than he had in many years. "She always had a bigger heart than mine. She always believed small acts of kindness could change the world." And she was right, it seems. They sat in silence for a few minutes, savoring the moment. Then Walter stood up. "Shall we?" he invited, holding out his hand to his daughter. "We still have a lot of work to do." As they walked toward the shelter, Daisy and Scout came to meet them, as if they'd heard the call. Together, the 4 of them followed the path Walter had built, connecting his home to the shelter. The man who had once risked his life to save a dog trapped on a cliff had discovered a simple truth. Sometimes we save others only to realize that, in the end, we were the ones truly saved. The end of the story. And now, dear listener, what did you think of this story of perseverance and love? If it touched your heart, don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel to follow other heartwarming stories like this one. Your comments are our greatest reward. Tell us your favorite part. Thank you so much for joining us.